Well, let's talk about your benchmarks, Alex, because I think it's fair to say that nobody else in the PC tech press is going to be using the kind of stress tests that you put this thing through.
No.
You want raster benchmarks, you're going to have to go elsewhere because, Alex, this really is quite impressive. Alex, you looked at 3 games. You looked at Cyberpunk 2077, the inbuilt benchmark there, Doom the Dark Ages, and going back to a classic there, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which certainly an interesting game from a benchmarking perspective, and certainly with this one. Now, let's sort of start by talking about Cyberpunk 2077. You chose an interesting configuration here. You basically captured in video everything that I needed to replicate it, and as far as I can see, it's basically alt for settings, but then you turned on ray tracing for ray traced reflections and ray traced sun shadows. You turned off some post-processing, but I doubt that would have a huge effect on the benchmarks there.
No.
So, basically an iGPU alt for settings with some pretty heavy ray tracing effects as well. That's why I'm saying for a start that I don't think anybody else would be doing these kind of benchmarks. And secondly, if Intel was going to be specifying what kind of benchmarks to put an integrated processor through, it won't be these.
No. The recommendations were basically high across the board in all their games with no ray tracing on for many of the titles. So I was like, everyone's going to get those numbers. Let's get some more interesting.
Yeah, okay. So let's kick off with Cyberpunk, shall we? Because it is kind of like a staple game, a benchmarking game at this point. And I'm actually quite interested in the result here. You can see in this visualization that the Core Ultra 9 X9 388H, I've stacked it up against the AMD competition. The Ryzen AI 9H X370 is effectively Strix Point, the highest end Strix Point, and the Ryzen AI Max Plus 395 Strix Halo. So here's the thing, right? Based on your hardware info stats, the CPU package was running between, I think, 58 to 64 watts in this Cyberpunk demo. And, well, how are we going to get equivalent results? Well, this is a B-Link SER9 mini PC with that Strix Point processor, and it does run at 65 watts. And Strix Halo, we've got this GM Tech Evo X2, I believe it's called there. And we could run that at 65 watts. So we've tried to sort of produce the same level of power budget for each of these parts. And interesting results here with Cyberpunk. Let's start with Panther Lake here, an average of 29.05 frames per second. Obviously, it will dip below 30, it will go above 30. That's the average there. That is our baseline with Panther Lake there. And I'd say bearing in mind our settings here, and it is native 1080p. There's no upscaling. We'll get onto that shortly. Basically, Strix Point is only delivering about 54% of Panther Lake throughput there, which is quite remarkable. Strix Halo is a much bigger chip, I'd say, and it is faster, 35.96 FPS average, 24% faster. But, basically Panther Lake is in a really nice sort of middle ground there. Plenty of scope for optimized settings, Alex, perhaps without ray tracing.
Could have done that too. That's true.
Quickly, let's move on to adding in some 2x2 upscaling. So Panther Lake actually increases significantly there. It's almost double the throughput, but we're up to like 56 frames per second, actually 55.96 frames per second. Strix Point gets up to 32.5. 58% of the throughput of Panther Lake. So that, I was seeing a lot of headlines about a bloodbath for AMD. Well, certainly compared to the existing Strix Point, and the new Gorgon Point is essentially a refined version of Strix, so it'd be slightly faster, but not that much faster. I mean, that is like a massive result. In this scenario, Strix Halo 23.7% ahead. Interesting stuff. And of course, frame generation. What's interesting about this, Alex, is that I actually looked frame by frame because you took 1080p 120 captures here. I looked frame by frame at the frame generation. I don't think this particular subject is particularly taxing for frame gen, but the frame gen quality looked pretty good, I thought.
Yeah, the ML frame gen, essentially, we saw it both running in the 2x, 3x, and 4x mode in various different titles. Yep. And at one point, we were playing Claire Obscure 33, Expedition 33, and I was thinking, is this the 2x mode?
Right.
And then we went in and we're like, no, it is actually the 4x mode. So I think that does say quite a bit about the quality. Now, a look at some things like frame pacing as well as quality versus other upscalers would require further work. But I would say it passed the this is good enough eye test when looking at a laptop screen at a normal viewing distance.
Yeah. I think the expectation quality-wise with a mobile GPU is actually quite different from desktop, but that's another thing we can talk about later. Frame generation, yeah. Basically, at this point, the Panther Lake average is going up to like 96.6 frames per second. Bearing in mind that we're using like ray tracing here and rasters are ultra, that's pretty good going, I would say. And in fact, just XeSS balanced on the super resolution side of things, getting you like to an average of 56. I think that's really, really impressive as well. Yeah, you can see the AMD equivalents there. There's not really much ground gained using frame generation on Strix point. What's happening with Strix Halo is that the amplification of frame generation, you actually hit the 120 FPS VSync limit towards the end of the benchmark there. So it's not really fair to talk about the performance differential there. I've got it as about 22% faster there, but that will be limited slightly by those VSync cap parts of the benchmark. So you kind of got a lie of the land of how Intel is taking the fight to AMD there. And I'm actually really impressed because not specifically talking about these benchmarks, but it gives you an idea of the horsepower on tap and potentially what you can do with other games. And I think that's potentially quite compelling. And also the fact that, well, you've essentially demonstrated that you can actually have a pretty good ray traced experience on an integrated GPU. I think that's pretty fantastic, Alex.
Yeah, basically, the reason why I did actually focus on ray tracing is because forward-looking games, one of the areas where we see with handhelds and potentially even lower powered laptops is we can see them running the PS4 era stuff well enough.
Yeah.
And we can see them running the early PS5 cross-gen stuff well enough. But as soon as you get to anything heavier, that is where memory performance and GPU RT acceleration becomes much more handy. And in this case, I was actually most impressed by the native resolution bends here. I was not expecting near 30 at all. And here we are, getting almost near 30 FPS at 1080p native, which I would never recommend anyone, of course, using this GPU. But it just shows that when fully utilized, like so much saturation there, it actually holds up well and doesn't require necessarily the crutches of using frame gen. Although I would heavily recommend here, of course, turning out those things.
The final Cyberpunk benchmark is basically scaling from native through to XeSS balance, which is a 2x2 scale, right, Alex? It is 540p internal, yeah. And then with frame generation on top of that, that's 2x frame gen. Obviously, you've got 3x and 4x in the pocket as well. So, yeah, I mean, you start at 29.05 FPS average, a gain of 92.6% by going up to XeSS balance, which is great because a lot of integrated mobile parts, frame generation comes with a cost that sometimes negates the point of using it, but we're getting like pretty much 2x scaling there, which I think is quite remarkable. And then you've got the same XeSS balance with frame generation on top. It's 232.5% faster than native and it's about 73% faster than balance there. So, man, this sets the scene very, very nicely for some. It's actually this benchmarks that made me think, well, maybe we should be looking at lower end discrete graphics as a comparison point as well. And we've got some interesting results going forward there. Any thoughts, Oliver?
No, I just think this is really cool. Actually, in some of the benchmarks that Alex and I were looking at with frame generation enabled in titles like Dying Light the Beast, in titles like Expedition 33, we were, hitting 120 FPS. We're hitting pretty high frame rates to the point where it's kind of like, okay, well, what's the utility of this necessarily in a mobile screen? Is that really something you're looking for? Indeed, on Battlefield 6, which we also saw, we were getting frame rates well in excess of 200 FPS using totally reasonable settings with XeSS and XeSS frame generation. And it's like, okay, this is like pushing mobile graphics to a level that you wouldn't really need on a mobile display, although it really does
Right.
show the capability here and indeed the incredible efficiency that we're getting out of frame generation on this platform. I would not expect that necessarily out of a low-end mobile GPU or certainly an integrated graphics solution.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive stuff. So let's move on. Let's move on to another, I'd say it's an insane benchmark that nobody is ever going to be trying elsewhere, but here we are. And I actually think, again, we're getting some great results here. Doom the Dark Ages. Obviously, id Software put together I guess you could call it a sort of super light setting designed for handheld devices. But that's not good for Alex Battaglia, no.
Definitely ain't.
1080p native, ultra settings. Which I think is just absolutely fantastic, because this shouldn't work. This should not work on an integrated graphics part. However, a 33.3 FPS average sets the baseline there. Strix Point can only do 16.34 FPS, pretty much just under half of the total there. Strix Halo is 30% ahead though, which is a slightly wider differential compared to Cyberpunk there. Alex, why did you choose this?
Well, I think once again, the future of gaming is going to be ray tracing. And in this case, we're looking at a highly optimized ray trace title. Cyberpunk, I would say, is just fully focused on, it was just made at a time when it wasn't really about making it run fast while having ray tracing. It was just the extra icing on the top. And here it's a game fully integrated with it.
Yes.
And I thought it was a perfect opportunity, because also the handheld version of this game, yes, it's got that handheld graphics mode, but what happens if you put it on those desktop graphics? That's what I kind of wondered, and here it is.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good result, because we're not using any upscaling here. All of these benchmarks, unless stated otherwise, are 1080p native. And ultra settings. I did smile, Alex, as you were scrolling through the menu there. It's just like, okay.
Yeah. In this case, this was a title where I looked back at it running at an RTX 2060.
Right.
If you recall,
Yes.
For a video that I made. And here I'm actually seeing results where I'm thinking, I thought I was impressed with the RTX 2060's power in this title, in spite of everything. But that was heavily utilizing upscaling to get it to the point where it was. And here I imagine we'd be getting better performance, which is great.
Interesting. Certainly very, very interesting results there. Final test, and it's actually, it's a bit of a weird one. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a game that we used to benchmark quite heavily, but not so much these days. But I'm curious why you chose this one, Alex.
Well, this one is more of a joke one, because behind us, they kept joking about Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Adam from PC World. And I just had to, sorry, I had to turn it on for some reason. But also, I pressed for time. I wanted ones with actual in-game benchmarks that were easily recreatable. And in this case, thankfully, it is easily recreatable.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is that we have a video capture form of benchmarking. Slightly limited here in that we had to use VSync on site, but with a 120 FPS or hertz window, you pretty much capture all of the resolution, the temporal resolution that you're getting there. But it also meant that, at the end, you get quite a detailed outline of the benchmark results that we can use to verify our video capture, or at least compare. And everything's sort of lined up quite nicely. Shadow of the Tomb Raider also quite interesting in that it has 3 distinct segments, and they're weird. I mean, historically, people have produced averages of the whole 3 segments, but individually they produce different results. Segment 1 here is actually pretty good on Panther Lake. 42.6 FPS sets the baseline there. About 24.3 FPS on Strix Point, 57% of the output of Panther Lake. 67.96, 68 FPS, 59% faster on Strix Halo there. Interesting. So that's a big, big leap for Strix Halo there. Not so much for Strix Point. But going into segment 2, we actually sort of back to where we should be, 39.6 FPS average for Panther Lake, about half that on Strix Point on average across this particular sequence. Now, this time, we've just got a 32% advantage for Strix Halo, which is kind of more in line with what we would expect elsewhere. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe there was, maybe there's something, maybe it was just a hiccup on Panther Lake, or in that initial segment. It can happen based on my extensive benchmarking of that particular title. Or maybe it's just different workloads, bearing in mind that, yes, Alex, we are using the highest settings here, and you're using ultra ray tracing, ray trace shadows.
To say a little bit about the game itself, I played a lot with this one back in the day, and going through the benchmark, the one that is, at least in my humble opinion here, most representative of most of the game's scenarios is actually roughly segment 2.
Yeah.
Because segment 2 takes place in the jungle, which is where most of the game takes place if you played it.
Fair point.
Whereas segment 1 is just the game's intro. And segment 3, as nice as it is to have, the first part of segment 3 where it chases through a valley, that is not representative of any gameplay.
No.
Actually.
Maybe looking at the sky.
Maybe if you look at the sky in the game, you'll get a good thing. So I actually think segment 2 here is pretty realistic. And in that, if I were to play this game today, there's no reason I wouldn't turn on the shadows. Honestly, it's that old at this point, so I just keep them on.
Yeah, I mean, segment 3, 37 FPS average on Panther Lake, 56% of the throughput on Strix Point, 41% faster Strix Halo. So I think we're sort of starting to get an idea of how all of the individual iGPUs are comparing there. I think you can basically consider Panther Lake to be twice as fast as Strix Point based on these particular ray tracing workloads at least. Strix Halo is ahead, but then again it is basically almost like a portable PlayStation 5. Really, they really went to town with that iGPU. So that's basically our integrated graphics comparisons there. It's looking very, very strong, I'd say. What do you think, Oliver?
I think it's quite compelling here. I mean, nearly double the performance of Strix Point or double the performance of Strix Point in many benchmarks. That's obviously very good, I think. This looks like it'd be really good for 1080p gaming, but I think it really depends on what your point of reference is, right? Because whether it's more similar to Strix Halo or Strix Point in your own terminology, obviously cost-wise, that's an area that we still have to work out. In terms of die area, it seems pretty similar to Strix Point at 223 millimeters squared for Strix Point, and I think something quite similar for Panther Lake here. It really depends on how you count the die area, though, between the 3 main dies and then the base tile, right? Because obviously the base tile is considerably wider. But obviously you have a mix of process technologies there in Panther Lake, and then for something like Strix Halo, you're looking at TSMC 4 nanometers. So there's kind of a little bit of a divergence there, although exactly how well certain elements scale is kind of up to another set of debates. But obviously the fact that, I mean, we haven't really touched on this too much in our benchmarks here in terms of the comparative analysis, but the fact that we're dealing with XeSS, machine learning-based frame generation, or machine learning-based super resolution on Panther Lake versus the AMD parts, that really does suggest another level of performance acceleration on those parts that you're not going to get on the AMD parts.
Essentially here, although we're doing ISO benching between the parts, which is what you would do for a normal benchmark sequence, the real usage of this thing is you turning on XeSS versus someone who has a Strix Halo or Strix Point device, either using XeSS DP4A or FSR3, right? And we know those are inferior experiences in terms of image quality. And I think that is the extra sauce that people are looking for in the mobile area. And it's one of the things I've lamented with every new mobile part from AMD is the lack of RDNA 4, so you can't get FSR4 there in an easy way. And here you're actually getting that machine learning CNN quality, plus very surprisingly good looking frame generation, which I think is a bonus that you have on the software there that you just don't see in AMD.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to get a couple of points in on the comparisons that we've made here. First of all, we did use 65 watt TDP on the AMD parts. Now, I've got to say that although Strix Point here you can flood it with 65 watts, it doesn't really do anything for the processor. It kind of taps out around 30 watts. There's very little extra juice to be had just by flooding it with extra power. So, in that sense, perhaps a slightly different class of processor. We just don't know because we don't know in what power configurations Panther Lake is going to operate in. Similarly, with Strix Halo, it can potentially go significantly faster still than the results of Panther Lake here, because you can up the wattage to like, up to 120 watts. Now, there are severe diminishing returns beyond sort of 80, and 65 is kind of like a nice sweet spot. But the fact is that more performance is available depending on the device. And we're not quite sure how that sort of proliferation of different power profiles is going to play out with Panther Lake. But I think, Oliver, I think one of the great draws of this potentially is that if your overall system power draw is like significantly below 100 watts, you should be getting full performance off battery, right?
Yeah, that's correct. You should be getting full performance off battery. That's an issue that we tend to note with discrete graphics equipped units, ultra portable units even. When you do have them off of battery, they tend to degrade significantly in performance. Indeed, Alex and I saw an Alienware unit that had RTX 5090 mobile graphics that I think had a 240 watt power draw under load, which is obviously well beyond the capability of any battery, and also would just immediately deplete even 100 watt hours of battery capacity. So these are units that, especially at like, reduced, we didn't have an opportunity to test this, but presumably at reduced wattages at 30 watts, 40 watts, you could actually have reasonable runtime on battery with these units, which is something you can't really say as much for any discrete graphics equipped laptop. Like if you're trying to fit a DGPU laptop, even with something like an RTX 5060 mobile, you're not going to get that into a 25 or 30 watt power envelope. Whereas you might be able to do that with this product and actually get reasonable performance.
Yeah, on the prior generation Lunar Lake, you actually had a really good performance profile at 30 watt, which they use for the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus, which I think is an underrated handheld there. And potentially we're going to be seeing handhelds with Panther Lake as well. In fact, I think it's pretty much a given, isn't it, Alex?
Yeah, they did mention it, that they're going to create some sort of handheld standard from their perspective for Intel stuff. And they had a lot of names on that slide during the presentation in the Intel reveal event. So we'll see what that means, including a Microsoft was listed there. So we'll see what that means. But yeah, we're looking at the laptop part, and maybe we can extrapolate a bit later on in this video about what it means for the handheld, but it's exciting.